6,000 square kilometers of heavily fortified territory disappeared from Russian control in only 96 hours. It was the kind of collapse that should not have been possible in modern warfare. Every principle of contemporary military doctrine suggested that such a fortified defensive zone should have held for weeks, if not months. The Russian General Staff had spent months transforming the Kharkiv region into a hardened fortress of trenches, concrete, steel, artillery positions, and layered defenses manned by some of their most experienced motorized rifle formations. Yet on the morning of September 6, 2022, that entire defensive system began to collapse, as if it had never truly existed. What followed was not just a battlefield defeat, it was the unraveling of an army's confidence, command structure, and illusion of control. But the story of how Ukraine shattered the Russian army in Kharkiv does not begin with a massive artillery barrage or a frontal armored breakthrough. It begins with deception, psychological warfare, and one of the most effective operational feints of the entire war. For weeks, the Ukrainian high command made sure the world was focused somewhere else. They openly signaled that a major counteroffensive was coming in the southern Kherson region. Equipment movements were made in broad daylight. Preparations appeared visible enough to be noticed. Communications were allowed to paint a picture that Russian intelligence could not ignore. Russian surveillance systems, satellite coverage, and intelligence officers monitored the buildup and accepted the story exactly as intended. Believing the decisive threat was coming in the south, Russian commanders reacted accordingly. They began pulling elite units away from the north, stripping critical sections of the Kharkiv front to reinforce Kherson. Seasoned paratroopers, heavy tank units, and more capable formations were loaded onto trains and sent south. What remained behind in the north was a weakened shell of exhausted troops, poorly prepared conscripts, and internal security personnel tasked with holding one of the most important fronts in the war. The illusion had worked perfectly, and the trap was ready. At exactly 0600 hours on September 6th, the illusion broke. The real strike came not in the south but against the thinly defended Russian positions near the northern city of Balakliya. The Russian troops dug into their trenches, expected the kind of battle they understood. A slow, grinding exchange of artillery, cautious movement, and predictable escalation. Instead, they were hit by something far more chaotic and devastating. Ukrainian special forces and highly mobile infantry formations launched a fast-moving assault that resembled a swarm more than a conventional army. Rather than sending in slow, heavy armor to batter through the front line, Ukraine relied on speed, surprise, and maneuver. Fleets of light Humvees armed with .50 caliber machine guns raced across open terrain at speeds approaching 80 kilometers per hour. They ignored the roads completely, knowing Russian artillery had already pre-registered those routes for defensive fires. The open fields, while dangerous, offered unpredictability. Russian battalion commanders had only minutes to process what was happening. They attempted to call for air support, but Ukrainian electronic warfare teams had already disrupted and blinded their communications. Local command posts were suddenly cut off and plunged into radio silence. By the time Russian conscripts understood that they were under full-scale assault, Ukrainian vehicles were already operating 10 kilometers behind their front trenches. In a matter of moments, the entire geometry of the battlefield had changed. A defensive line can only function if communication holds it together, and the Russians were now deaf, blind, and encircled by confusion. What followed was a complete collapse in operational coherence that spread through the Russian chain of command like a virus. The speed of the Ukrainian advance created a terrifying delay in information flow. Russian generals positioned 50 kilometers behind the front were making decisions using maps that were already obsolete. They issued artillery fire missions against coordinates that Ukrainian units had left hours earlier. Meanwhile, the Russian soldiers at the front experienced something even more destructive than firepower: psychological shock. They began hearing the unmistakable roar of heavy diesel engines not from the front, but from behind them, from directions they believed were secure. That moment broke something fundamental. The realization that they had been outmaneuvered so completely and so quickly shattered unit cohesion. Within 36 hours, planned withdrawals turned into panic-driven escapes. The myth of the Russian war machine began to unravel from the inside. Soldiers tore off uniforms, discarded body armor, and stole bicycles from civilians just to get away from the advancing Ukrainian columns. They left behind ammunition, weapons, vehicles, and supplies on a scale so massive it almost seemed unreal. The quantity of equipment abandoned in perfect condition was staggering. Warehouses filled with artillery shells, millions of rounds of small arms ammunition, and stockpiles of anti-tank guided missiles were left open and untouched. The defenders had become prey, and the entire Russian northern flank began collapsing in a condition approaching total freefall. The true magnitude of the disaster emerged as Ukrainian forces drove deeper toward the strategic hub of Izyum. This city was not just another objective, it was the crown jewel of the Russian northern axis. the logistical center that anchored the broader Eastern Front. Russian battalions defending the area were equipped with T-80 main battle tanks, 46-ton machines with gas turbine engines and advanced armor, each one representing a major investment of Russian military power. But when Ukrainian troops reached the outskirts of the city, they encountered something surreal. Silence. The Russian tank crews had fled. Multi-million-dollar tanks sat abandoned in the forests, fully fueled, loaded with ammunition, and left in working order. Ukrainian infantry entered encampments to find meals, still hot on tables, and radios still emitting empty static. The retreat had become so frantic that Russian troops did not even take time to destroy cryptographic gear or disable their own vehicles. In only 4 days, Ukrainian forces captured more usable heavy armor from the retreating enemy than they themselves had lost over the previous 6 months of fighting. At the heart of this disaster was the mathematics of artillery warfare. Under normal conditions, a Russian artillery battery needed around 15 minutes from the moment a target was identified to the moment its first 152mm shells struck the ground. But Ukraine's assault was not unfolding like a traditional mechanized offensive. Its forward elements were racing across terrain in light, unarmored columns at speeds exceeding 60 km per hour. By the time Russian observers spotted them, relayed coordinates, processed fire missions, and calculated trajectories, the Ukrainian units were already several kilometers away. Russian artillery was firing at empty space. The entire system was too slow for the battle it was trying to fight. Russian command structures began to buckle under a flood of rapidly changing battlefield variables. Their communications, already dependent on outdated and often unencrypted systems, became saturated with frantic reports from collapsing checkpoints and isolated units. Even when artillery commanders finally received accurate coordinates, they encountered a deeper problem. Ukrainian formations had advanced so quickly that they were now operating inside the minimum safe engagement range of Russian heavy guns. To fire on them risked dropping shells directly on their own retreating troops. The Russian doctrine of slow, crushing artillery dominance was rendered useless by one factor above all others: speed. While Russian artillery struggled to solve an impossible equation, Ukrainian commanders were seeing the battlefield with extraordinary clarity. And they were doing it not with expensive satellite networks but with commercially available drones modified in secret workshops. On the morning of September 8th, swarms of cheap quadcopters spread across the skies above the Oskil River. Each one cost only a fraction of the systems Russia depended on, yet together they effectively neutralized an entire defensive line worth billions. Operators sitting safely in concealed bunkers behind the front fed real-time targeting information straight to the fast-moving assault columns. Whenever a Russian convoy attempted to regroup at a crossroads or form a defensive cluster, drones found them almost instantly. Within less than a minute, guided artillery rockets could strike those exact coordinates. Russian electronic warfare systems, which on paper were supposed to jam signals across huge sectors of the battlefield, were largely silent. Ukrainian intelligence had spent weeks identifying the thermal signatures and likely positions of those Russian jamming vehicles. When the offensive began, those systems became top priority targets. Specialized anti-radiation and precision-guided strikes eliminated them early in the operation. Once blind, deaf, and hunted from above, Russian officers lost any realistic ability to command. Their headquarters were either destroyed by precision fire or abandoned in panic. The breaking point came when retreating Russian units surged toward the last viable escape routes east of the Oskil River. Panic spread through tens of thousands of fleeing soldiers, mixed with local collaborators and civilian traffic, creating huge traffic jams at pontoon crossings and river bottlenecks. Ukrainian forward units, sensing the scale of the collapse, drove harder to close the trap. At 14:30, Ukrainian mechanized forces captured high ground overlooking one of the main crossing points. What they saw below was total logistical collapse. Armored personnel carriers, fuel trucks, supply lorries, and commandeered civilian cars were packed bumper to bumper for kilometers. Officers, stripped of authority by the chaos, physically fought with their own men for a place on escaping vehicles. The strict hierarchy that Russian doctrine depended on had broken apart into a desperate struggle for personal survival. Ukrainian troops did not need to launch a reckless frontal attack. They simply positioned heavy machine guns and anti-tank missiles to dominate the routes and shut the exit. The trapped Russian troops now faced a brutal reality. A deep river behind them, a rapidly advancing enemy in front of them, and vehicles running out of fuel. What had begun as a retreat was now becoming a trapped collapse. The sheer volume of equipment captured in this encirclement reshaped the strategic balance of the Eastern Front. Ukrainian logistics teams moving behind the combat spearheads struggled to even document the scale of what had been abandoned. Train yards contained rows of armored vehicles ready for deployment but never moved. Hidden in surrounding forests were camouflaged depots containing hundreds of thousands of artillery rounds. This was more than a tactical success. It was one of the largest unintentional transfers of military hardware in recent history. The Russian army had, in effect, become one of Ukraine's biggest suppliers of heavy weapons. Within days, equipment abandoned by Russian crews was being turned around, repaired if necessary, and fired back at the very army that had left it behind. The psychological impact on Russian high command was immense. They had not only lost over 6,000 square kilometers of crucial territory, they had lost the myth of their own strength. The fortified system they had spent months building was dismantled in 4 days of chaos, speed, and panic. Inside Russia's National Defense Control Center in Moscow, hundreds of kilometers away, commanders watched the strategic map bleed red. Their digital battlefield management systems, which were supposed to provide secure coordination across the front, were failing under pressure. Russia had invested heavily in encrypted communications architecture, but much of it depended on local civilian infrastructure, including cellular towers and stable power grids, to function effectively. As Ukrainian forces advanced rapidly, their electronic warfare units and sabotage operations systematically disrupted those local systems. Power nodes and communications infrastructure across the region went dark. Russian digital radios became nearly useless. With their network backbone collapsing, commanders were forced back onto unencrypted analog channels. Ukrainian intelligence operators listening from secure positions intercepted the disintegration in real time. They heard colonels pleading for air support that could not arrive, and generals threatening their own fleeing troops with punishment they no longer had the power to enforce. The image of a coordinated, modern military force dissolved into panicked voices moving through the airwaves. The final blow to Russia's hold on the sector came when Ukrainian units reached the outskirts of Kupiansk on September 10th. This city was not merely important. It was the central railway artery feeding the entire Russian eastern grouping. Every shell, every liter of diesel, every ration pack needed by tens of thousands of Russian troops moved through the Kupiansk rail network. Russian logistics are deeply dependent on rail transport and far less capable of sustaining major formations purely by road. Once the threat to Kupiansk became clear, the consequences were immediate. Russian soldiers understood that if the rail hub was lost, reinforcements and resupply would not come in time. That realization sparked a mass withdrawal that echoed some of the most chaotic retreats in military history. Troops abandoned fortifications, left behind advanced anti-aircraft systems worth millions, commandeered civilian cars, painted over markings, and fled east until they ran out of fuel. In only 144 hours, Ukraine had recaptured more than 6,000 square kilometers of sovereign territory. To grasp the pace of that advance, consider the contrast. Russian forces had spent the previous 150 days grinding through the eastern theater, suffering enormous losses to seize less than half that amount of ground. Ukraine achieved this with a fraction of the armor and air power that conventional doctrine would normally consider essential for such an offensive. Instead of overwhelming firepower, they used deception, speed, electronic disruption, and psychological shock. The more than 400 pieces of intact heavy equipment they captured made the attacking force materially stronger than it had been before the operation began. Russian fortifications built over half a year were bypassed, isolated, and surrendered without the kind of massive artillery battle Moscow expected. The whole model of a static war of attrition was shattered by the force of a brilliantly executed mobile offensive. The collapse was crystallized in one final episode near a small river crossing outside the village of Oskil on September 11th. A retreating Russian mechanized company, made up of 12 infantry fighting vehicles and around 150 exhausted soldiers, attempted to establish a temporary defensive position. They oriented their 30mm cannons toward the main highway, expecting a conventional assault to come straight at them. Instead, they were engaged by an enemy operating on speed, precision, and pure battlefield math. At 16:45, a Ukrainian special operations team positioned several kilometers away launched a tethered observation drone. Within 40 seconds, the drone operator identified the thermal signatures of Russian engines idling in the tree line. The coordinates were transmitted immediately to a mobile battery of Western-supplied howitzers positioned 15 kilometers away. The Russian commander had only 2 minutes and 10 seconds of warning, marked by the scream of incoming 155mm fire. The first strike did not even aim directly at the vehicles. It used advanced conventional munitions to scatter sub-munitions across the escape route, tearing apart the roadway and turning it into an impassable kill zone. In moments, the remaining armor was trapped. The entire engagement lasted under 4 minutes. A mechanized company was effectively destroyed without a single Ukrainian soldier needing to enter visual range. While artillery shattered the heavier vehicles, Ukrainian light infantry carried out the final exploitation with brutal efficiency. 3 columns of unarmored Humvees, racing at roughly 70 kilometers per hour, bypassed the burning wreckage and pushed into rear logistical zones. The Russian forces guarding these hubs had almost no awareness of what was approaching until it was too late. At 17:30, the lead Ukrainian vehicles reached a hill overlooking a major ammunition depot. Around 200 Russian conscripts were still guarding it, but they had lost all reliable contact with higher headquarters. The sight of enemy strike vehicles suddenly appearing deep behind what they believed to be a friendly rear area hit them harder than any barrage could have. The Ukrainian machine gunners barely needed to fire. The combination of speed, confusion, and the total loss of situational awareness caused the entire garrison to break psychologically on the spot. Rifles were dropped. Guard positions were abandoned. Men emerged with their hands raised. In less than 20 minutes, a supply node holding tens of thousands of artillery shells and millions of rounds of small arms ammunition was captured without a drop of blood being spilled. Russian doctrine, built on rigid top-down control and overwhelming defensive fires, had no answer for an enemy that could move faster than its own communications could process reality. And that was the deeper lesson of the Kharkiv collapse. Russia did not simply lose ground, it lost the ability to understand the battle it was fighting. Ukraine did not need to smash every fortified line head-on. It only needed to move faster than Russian command could think, faster than Russian artillery could calculate, and faster than Russian soldiers could recover from the shock of seeing the war suddenly appear behind them. In 4 days, a fortress became a rout, a defense became a stampede, and one of the most heavily fortified Russian positions in Ukraine ceased to exist as a coherent military front. What vanished in those 96 hours was not just territory. It was the illusion that Russia's war machine could survive a modern, intelligent, high-speed offensive.